Hello and welcome to episode 5 from the House of Dissent podcast. In this episode, I will be discussing the contribution of two of the writers associated with the Frankfurt School in relation to mass media communication research. They are Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. As the name states, the Frankfurt School were a group of writers based in the German city of Frankfurt, where they began their research in the early part of the 1920s. As I discussed in episode 1, it was largely believed by writers associated with British cultural and media studies that media criticism began with the Frankfurt School. However, our research was the first to document that this isn't the case. What we call radical mass media criticism is a category of thought that dispels this myth and offers new insights into the history and tradition of media criticism overall. The writers who preceded the Frankfurt School were Soren Kierkegaard, Karl Marx, Karl Kraus, Karl Bucher, Ferdinand Tönnies, and two American writers, Upton Sinclair and Robert E. Parks, and all are placed within the first and second periods of radical mass media criticism. However, it is important to note that there may be others yet to be revealed. The Frankfurt School are mainly placed in the fourth period, although, as I explained in episode 1, there was some crossover with the third period. But, nevertheless, we can see that the Frankfurt School comes somewhat later to the tradition of radical mass media criticism in our research. I also explained in episode 1 that the Frankfurt School writers had wrongly been associated with the hypodermic model theory. The author responsible for that model was the American journalist Vance Packard. In this episode, I will be paying reference to Chapter 5 of Radical Mass Media Criticism, A Cultural Genealogy, written by Hanno Hart. The chapter is titled The Frankfurt School and Aesthetic Discourse, Critical Theory, Art and the Critique of Mass Communication. Hanno was the John F. Murray Professor of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Iowa. He ended his academic career at the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia and passed away in 2011. Hanno co-edited the book Ferdinand Tönnies on Public Opinion with Slavko Splikal, published in 2002. Listeners may recall that in episode 4 of this podcast, I detailed Tönnies' contribution towards radical mass media criticism with regards to chapter 3 of our book, written by Slavko Splikal. I worked on 2 occasions with Hanno, the first with Radical Mass Media Criticism, A Cultural Genealogy, and second time on revisiting the Frankfurt School, which I edited in 2012. In that book, Hanno contributed a chapter on Leo Lowenthal from the Frankfurt School, whom Hanno had met. It's important to state that the writers who were central to the Frankfurt School were Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, Friedrich Pollock, and, as mentioned, Leo Lowenthal. Then there were writers closely associated with the school, such as Jürgen Habermas and Erich Fromm. And then there were, as David Held said, writers in the outer circle, on the periphery of the school, such as Walter Benjamin, Siegfried Kracauer, and not forgetting Hans Enzensberger. There are others not mentioned here because their work is not included in radical mass media criticism. What became known as the Frankfurt School was officially called the Institute for Social Research and was founded in Frankfurt in 1923. Its founder and benefactor, Felix Jose Weil, was born in Argentina in 1898. Weil was Jewish, a son of a wealthy grain merchant, hence his ability to fund and become the patron of the Institute for Social Research. But it was during his studies at the University of Frankfurt that Weil became interested in socialism. Friedrich Pollock helped co-found the Institute, and, like Weil, had a Jewish background, although Pollock's father taught him to disown Judaism. In 1924, Karl Grunberg became the first director of the Institute for Social Research, and in 1930, Max Horkheimer took over the directorship from Grunberg. One of the terms associated with the Frankfurt School is culture industry. It's discussed in the Dialectics of Enlightenment, written by Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, published in 1944. Horkheimer was born into a wealthy Jewish family, and Adorno had Jewish heritage, but his father converted to Protestantism, just like Karl Marx's father, who had converted from Judaism to Lutheranism. It's a remarkable book in that both writers offered a scathing criticism of the 18th century Enlightenment project, the so-called Age of Reason, a moment where mankind would be liberated from myths, where science based on empirical facts would replace simple belief in God and deities. Enlightenment for Adorno and Horkheimer was simply a turn towards liberalism, as liberal thinkers embraced the Enlightenment. Horkheimer would later claim that what many philosophers referred to as reason was in fact bourgeois reason, or reason based on liberal principles, then forwarded as natural principles as being the essence of human nature. This was all rejected as a manufactured concept of reason by Horkheimer in his book titled The Eclipse of Reason. Both Adorno and Horkheimer asked a simple question in the Dialectics of Enlightenment, which I am paraphrasing here. If the Enlightenment was so successful for liberating mankind, how is it that we are living in times of barbarism? Barbarism for them meant the rise of fascism and Stalinism from the 1920s onwards. You could even add the rise of authoritarian populism today in the USA, Hungary and elsewhere, with its emphasis on lies, conspiracy theories, and its turn to right-wing nationalism. The rise of fascism in the 1920s was particularly acute for the Frankfurt School in general because of their Jewish backgrounds and connections to Marxism, which the Nazis despised. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of the Dialectics of Enlightenment is that the authors argue that the Enlightenment not only failed as a project, but more crucially, was responsible for the rise of fascism and Stalinism, and they claim that it was also responsible for the creation of consumer society, mass advertising, and the culture industry. In sum, Adorno and Horkheimer argue that there was no disenchantment of the world during or after the Enlightenment. In other words, it had failed to dismantle superstition, myths, and belief in God. There was therefore a refutation that the Enlightenment heralded the dawn of rational thinking based on objective scientific notions of reason. They argued that post-Enlightenment capitalism had transformed culture into an industrialized project. Culture was to be commodified and was a commercial project distributed by mass communication networks. Rather than culture being authentically created by the people, the emerging mass production of products and ideas through mass media networks was controlling the new cultural landscape. The commercialization of culture through industrialized production was obliterating individuality, creating in turn mass consumers through the process of standardization. The chapter in the Dialectic of Enlightenment that is of interest here is titled The Culture Industry, Enlightenment as Mass Deception. And like Karl Kraus, Karl Bucher, Ferdinand Tönnies and others, the authors express their concerns with how language is concocted, endlessly repeated, and consumed. And with regards to the repetition of language, the authors say this on page 165. The American expression fad, used for fashions which appear like epidemics, that is, inflamed by highly concentrated economic forces, designated this phenomenon long before totalitarian advertising bosses enforced the general lines of culture. When the German fascists decide one day to launch a word, say, intolerable, over the loudspeakers, the next day the whole nation is saying intolerable. By the same pattern, the nations against whom the weight of the German blitzkrieg was thrown took to the word into their own jargon. The general repetition of names for measures to be taken by the authorities makes them, so to speak, familiar, just as the brand name on everybody's lips increased sales in the era of the free market. The blind and rapidly spreading repetition of words with special designations links advertising with the totalitarian watchword. The layer of experience which created the words for their speakers has been removed. And in this swift appropriation, language acquires the coldness which until now it had only had on billboards and in the advertisement columns of newspapers. So the question to ask is this: if the mass production of cultural products through advertising, radio, television, press industries, fashion magazines and more are so persuasive as a form of mass deception, how do we escape it and discover alternative modes of thinking that can challenge dominant narratives? Which brings me to the Frankfurt School's concept of critical theory, which is a conceptual framework that proposes to challenge not just the culture industry, but anything that is posed as a natural, not a manufactured product of capitalist mass production. In 1937, Max Horkheimer wrote his essay titled Traditional and Critical Theory, where he compared both theories. Horkheimer argued that traditional theories take existing systems as given. He claimed that the empirical research traditional theories were engaged in had a degree of validity about them, but they were ultimately limited in scope. For Horkheimer, traditional theories were forms of positivism, and that subsequently they failed to analyse the wider contexts in which they were operating in. Seen as such scientific research remains purely theoretical and completely detached from practical matters. Moreover, the reliance on well-worn, acceptable established concepts and categories simply reinforces dominant ideologies. In sum, traditional theories were obstacles to change. On the other hand, the underlying motive of critical theory is to be a transformative force in society. Its purpose is not to simply describe social reality, but to generate insights into the forces of domination operating within society in a way that can inform practical action and stimulate change. Horkheimer then sought to unite theory and practice, enabling intellectuals to grasp a dynamic unity with the oppressed class, as he said. Critical theory is based upon the abolition of social injustice and seeks the emancipation of the oppressed. The pursuit of knowledge per se is not the ultimate goal of critical theory, but rather, as Horkheimer said, the true objective was, and I quote, the emancipation from slavery. In Hanno Hart's chapter, he addresses critical theory in relation to both mass communication research and art. Allow me to read a passage from Hanno's chapter, in Radical Mass Media Criticism, A Cultural Genealogy, and the way he demonstrates the difference between American mass communication research as a traditional theory and compares it with critical theory. The relationship between critical theory, art, and mass communication is embedded in the history of recent cultural criticism, a history which gained in importance with the realization and understanding democracy must also mean understanding culture, and in particular the process of social communication. Critical theory, Hanno continues, has provided insights into the relationship between culture and domination, aesthetics and politics, and more specifically into the role of media. The study of mass communication, on the other hand, has traditionally been associated with the social and political dimensions of media and communication rather than with the aesthetic elements of society and art in particular. The latter remained in the margins of traditional mass communication research until the advent of critical theory and cultural studies, which challenged conventional ways of looking at mass communication. Their critique, in the sense of creating awareness of the social, political and economic status quo and the role of mass communication in prevailing regimes of domination, is rooted in the notion of culture and addresses the dominance of the culture industry. And Hanno goes on to say, the introduction of critical theory, with its origins in Germany, into the United States as a competing social and political theory of society, constituted a significant development in American social thought. It also penetrated the literature of mass communications, which introduced references to a critique of the cultural apparatus, aided by the interpretative works of Martin Jay, David Held, and Rolf Wiggerhaus, amongst others. Hanno wrote extensively on the American mass media research, accusing researchers within that field of inquiry as being parochial. And in this chapter, he explains how the objective for mass communication research in the USA was to present the media in broad terms as a social good. Something that was not only beneficial to society, but more importantly, how media could legitimately express the will of the individual. Individualism, or the myth of self-identity, is, after all, essential to consumer society. And here is what Hanno says on page 75. Combining the idea of democracy with the material and intellectual aspects of communication has been the prerogative of the social sciences, at least since the end of World War II. The resulting insights about communication and a democratic way of life dwell in the realm of an ideal world. Views of communication among free and equal members of the community, for instance, has been accompanied by social scientific mass communication research for most of the 20th century, beginning with the earlier sociological observations and ending with a fully fledged academic field of study. And Hanno goes on to say, yet communication research had been abandoned by American sociology and left to other academic interests, particularly journalism and mass communication studies, by the late 1940s. The latter turned away from questions of social control and integration and embarked instead on a search for the role of media and their contributions to society. This newly established academic domain developed a form of administrative communication research, neglecting the spirit of earlier commitments of the social sciences to social reform, to serve commerce and government. This shift to mass communication as a field of study constituted the first major break in the history of mass communication research, at least in the United States. It was foreshadowed by the declining influence of the Chicago School as a center of inquiry into the communication, self, and society. Mass communication research is a form of positivism that branch of social sciences the Frankfurt School were critical of because positivism claims to be value-free and objective form of analysis. As I explained earlier, it never offers a critique of economic and political systems it operates within and certainly does not advocate radical change. Whereas the Frankfurt School confronted mass culture and the culture industry and its dominating control of ideas over society by means of critical theory. Hanno was at pains to express how the inclusion of what he called the aesthetic dimension into mass communications research offers insights into processes of liberation. And here is what Hanno says on page 74. This chapter focuses on the aesthetic dimension of a critique of contemporary society, which is based on the potential of art, and the work of art as an emancipatory process, and as a source of an alternative vision of reality. In doing so, the chapter seeks to complement the genealogy of radical dissent in Western capitalist societies traced in this book, with considerations of the role and function of an aesthetic discourse. Critical theory, originated by the writers associated with the Frankfurt School, offers a significant departure from conventional approaches to mass communication studies, as largely developed in the USA, and becomes an important source for exploring media and communication in society. In the section titled Art and Critical Theory, Hanno explains how art as an individual expression of cultural production confronts commercially produced mass culture. And here is what Hanno says on page 80. The idea of art occupies members of the Frankfurt School, and Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, Leo Lowenthal and Walter Benjamin in particular in their confrontations with mass culture, the culture industry, and more generally in their critique of ideology. Critical theory approaches the role of aesthetics forcefully, although in a nuanced way, depending on the claims of individual authors, to contrast and compare the forces of domination and subjugation expressed in popular culture with the interpretation of art, not only in terms of their social or political relations, but also in terms of processes of production, exchange, and consumption. Hanno refers to Marx's theory of alienation, which is central to humanist Marxism. Briefly, it is the idea that under capitalism and mass production of commodities and culture, human beings have become alienated from themselves, from their human nature, from their collective spirit. There's not enough time here to go into detail about the theory of alienation, but if anyone listening would like me to do so in future podcasts, then please drop me a line. Returning to art, here is what Hanno says about the Frankfurt School writers on page 81. For Horkheimer, for instance, art offers opportunities for an alternative vision of life, removed from the sphere of commodity production and capable of projecting a different reality. Adorno focuses on the potential of autonomous art, its negation of the empirical reality of its own existence, and its power to reconstruct traditional meanings. Marcuse concludes that aesthetic transformation liberates objects, and that art, as an autonomous process, alienated from perceived social reality, maintains its independence and unites with forces involved in a critique of ideology. Lowenthal's approach rests on the recognition of the separate roles of art and popular culture, which depend on the history of social and psychological conditions of society and individuals, respectively. He turns the experience of literature and art to promote a humanistic meaning of communication, with references to a genuinely productive imagination, free from instrumental concepts of language and communication as information. Benjamin, on the other hand, sees the age of mechanical reproduction as providing opportunities for political change with the introduction of new techniques, and offers a more optimistic assessment of art as a mobilizing force. One controversial aspect of seeing art as an individual counter-narrative to mass production is public access to it. Not everyone will visit art galleries in the age of the internet and the exponential growth of mass communications. It may seem that art as an expression of individuality against corporate media power is subsequently dwarfed by its monolith competitor. But this is not the case. Firstly, the internet has allowed individual artists to share their works to a far wider audience than previously. And secondly, there is the exponential growth in street artists, showcasing their work in living environments, allowing the public to view firsthand. Banksy, known for his art and activism, has a museum dedicated to his work in Madrid and has an active presence online. And then there are a whole host of street artists out there, such as the French artist Blek Lerat, Oscar Meos, the Portuguese identical twins, and the American Swoon. A particular favourite of mine is the American Frank Shepard Fairey, who is inspired by phenomenology and often uses Marshall McLuhan's "The medium is the message" slogan in his work. Marshall McLuhan will feature in a later episode. The campaign group Amplifier's slogan, "We the People" campaign, is particularly interesting, stating on the website it aims to restore hope, imagination, curiosity and creativity into our country's dialogue. There's an image on their website based on a photograph taken by Ridwan Adhami, showcased on the 5th anniversary of 9/11. It's a powerful image of a Muslim woman wearing an American flag as a hijab. The image on Amplifier's website was recreated 10 years later by both Adhami and Fairey. Then there's the Melbourne-based art collectors Sandra Powell and Andrew King, known as Sandrew, who told the Guardian newspaper that the art establishment are ambivalent about the legitimacy of street art, with Powell saying they don't understand it and they don't have control over it. Andrew King also said that street artists operate outside the art establishment. The street are their galleries and their art is open to people. But crucially for me, they can go beyond and complement their street art by going onto the internet. And this is, in my view, is art and critical theory combined. Critical theory has had a huge impact on mass media communications. For example, it influenced researchers involved with critical discourse analysis that emerged in the United Kingdom. And it has influenced our thinking on mass media criticism by using the word radical to denote the same outcomes as critical theory in relation to media research. That is, to go beyond mere criticism, as I outlined in Chapter 1 of Radical Mass Media Criticism, A Cultural Genealogy. So, we see how critical theory has influenced radical mass media criticism by seeking to abolish social injustice and think about alternatives to free market capitalism. But it is the mainstream media, along with the purveyors of neoliberal ideologies, who, as Adorno said, negate alternatives to what already exists. In fact, the mainstream media is essential for consolidating capitalist structures through advertising and journalistic practice. Well, that's it for another episode of House of Dissent. The next episode discusses the work of Jürgen Habermas in relation to the media and the public sphere. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.